union budget, as I said, is like a household budget. The only advantage is that government, since it is a sovereign, has the right to A, tax, and B, it can also borrow. But then we'll go on to what is the background against which a budget has to be framed. What is the budget all about? The budget of the union government is very much like the household budget that we draw up. Basically, it's a table, as it were, tabular formation of what your receipts are going to be and what your expenditure is going to be. So just as every household budget, every month you sit down and decide what is your inflow, what is your income for that month going to be, and what are your monthly expenditure. Similarly, the government also draws up a similar kind of calculation does. What are all the receipts it's going to get? What are not necessarily revenues, because government, apart from tax revenues, is also able to borrow. In fact, that is a key difference between a household budget and the union budget, because the government, unlike ordinary household, is able to borrow almost as much as it wants. Of course, there is a certain limit, because prudent governments will not want to borrow too much, because the moment you borrow, you have to repay. So every government budget is drawn on what do you expect to receive by way of receipts in the next year, and what are our expenses in the next year. And in a developing country like ours, obviously your expenses are going to be much more than your receipts, whether revenue or non-tax revenue like disinvestment receipts. So then the government bridges this deficit by borrowing. So a union budget, as I said, is like a household budget. The only advantage is that government, since it is a sovereign, has the right to A, tax, and B, it can also borrow. But then we'll go on to what is the background against which a budget has to be framed. So basically, there are two truths that underlie every budget. One is that one must accept, and I think it's important for the Aam Aadmi, the citizen, to accept that budgets are not magic wands. We in India get very hyped up over the budget, but in most countries in the world, I don't think the average citizen even knows when the budget is being presented. So the first truth is that the budget is not a magic wand. It can't solve all our problems overnight. The second truth is that every budget has to be framed in the context in which the economy is at the moment. So today, for instance, the government is framing the budget in the context. What is the global context? What is the domestic context? Here, right now, the global context is that we are seeing geopolitical tension. The war in Ukraine continues. We're seeing the US Fed tighten monetary policy. What are the implications for countries like India? Then we also have, in the Indian context, we have high inflation, and there is a prospect of growth coming down in the next year. Because if you look at economic growth, which is the fundamental driver of government's revenue and people's well-being, growth is a function of four key levers, if you want to call it. One is exports, one is private consumption, one is investment, and one is government spending. Now, in the last year, exports had done very well. But as we saw, as the year came to an end, we saw that because of global tensions, recessions perhaps in a large part of particularly the Western world, the demand for our exports started falling. So exports as a key driver will no longer be there. Then similarly, as far as consumption is concerned, because as inflation begins to bite, you will find consumption demand coming down. So exports are no longer going to drive the growth. Consumption is faltering. Investment, we've seen that despite the huge concessions in corporate tax that the government had allowed in 2019-20, corporates have not really started investing in a big way, partly because of COVID and partly because they're still hesitant. They don't know which way the economy, growth at large is going to go. So in private investment has not picked up either. That leaves only the last lever, government spending. Now the problem is that government spending is a function of how much revenue the government gets, and how much non-tax revenue the government gets, and its expenditure. Now, if the government wants to do things like, supplying food security, they want to ensure food security to more than 80% of the population. Now, that's going to cost money. Fertilizer subsidies, that's going to cost money. So all this government spending is a function of what is the surplus that they get between the government's receipts, that is tax revenue, non-tax revenue, and its expenditure. Inevitably, as I said, in countries like ours, expenditure is always more than what the government's receipts are. So the question is that the government has to borrow. Can it borrow unlimited amounts? No, it cannot. Why can it not borrow unlimited amounts? Simply because the government's borrowing, which is basically what we call the fiscal deficit or the excess of government expenditure over its receipts, is a key determinant of what the interest rate will be in the economy. Why do I say that? Simply because government as a sovereign there is the debt to the government, any borrowing that the government does is completely risk-free. So when you buy a Government of India bond, a Government of India security, you don't worry that the government will default. Unlike if you borrow, you lend to say any large business house also we've seen some of the largest business houses have defaulted. Whereas in the case of the government, there is no question of their defaulting simply because government as a sovereign can always tax more. It can also print money. Of course, prudent governments don't print money recklessly, because then that has inflationary implications. So the government's fiscal deficit is important because it determines how much will you be able to repay. So if you borrow a very large amount, your fiscal deficit is very large, then the next year you'll have to generate that much more surplus in order to start repaying that. Secondly, it also determines the interest rate at which all other companies and individuals can borrow, because government's borrowing is what is called the benchmark rate. So over and above the benchmark rate of government, we add what is known as a risk premium, either for corporates or for individuals. So when government borrowing rate goes up, all of us also suffer the consequences. Borrowing for us also goes up.